Hi there, Stan Stahl, president of SecureTheVillage. This is our 4th annual edition of CybersecureLA, kind of under very different circumstances than the last few. But that said, we're going to go through it and have actually what we think is a very interesting program set up for today. We're going to look at the subject of a reasonable approach to reasonable security. We'll talk some more about why that's the, if you will, the subject of the day in cybersecurity. We'll see this. It's a survey, 2.5 hours. We can't go into in-depth. You're certainly going to want to talk to your service providers, your attorneys, your cyber insurance people, your security providers, and so on, and also use the rest of the SecureTheVillage resources that we have put together for you as you learn more about this topic. But we're looking forward to an interesting discussion on it over the next, as I say, 2.5 hours. And this is all in the context that October every year is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. This is the 17th annual Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and we're part of that. The organization Stay Safe Online, public-private partnership, does so much work in helping to spread the word, grow the village, if you will, about cybersecurity and what we all have to do to stay safe, stay secure. We're SecureTheVillage, of course. We're a community-based response to the cybercrime and privacy crisis. Our raison d'etre, if you will, is to turn people and organizations into cyber guardians from the boardroom to the living room. That's our challenge. Today, much more focused towards the boardroom. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're so grateful to the support of Miller Kaplan, CPA firm that bought our company earlier this year and has become a major sponsor to SecureTheVillage. We're grateful to them. An outline for today, this welcome. We're going to spend a couple of minutes just framing cybersecurity, reasonable security, and then we're going to jump into a panel discussion on identifying your risks. That'll be followed by several polls. We're going to be taking polls throughout the day. In fact, we're going to take our first one in just a moment. Number of polls around identifying risk tolerance. That's a critical piece of the subject of reasonable security. We'll have breakout on a cybercrime case study. We'll tell you about that when we get closer to it. Then another panel. What are the elements of reasonable security? The various pieces that have to go together if you're going to be able to articulate and support reasonableness. And then checklist, left that off the agenda. Missed that, my bad. But we'll have kind of a flow chart, how to put your own personal, figure it out what's reasonable for you. And then we'll look at resources on reasonableness. It's something that SecureTheVillage has been a part of what we've been for several years. You're looking at several of our panelists. I'll introduce them from alphabetically. Bob Braun of Jeffrey Mangles. You want to say hello? Yeah.
Nice to see everyone.
Yes, we're very happy you're here. You're part of us today. Jason Mexico of InTouch Insurance Services.
Hello, everybody. Jason from InTouch Insurance, full service risk management insurance brokerage, specializing in data privacy, insurance, as well as cyber liability. Thank you for having me.
Super. Hey, glad you're here. Tom Peistrup.
Good afternoon, everyone. Tom Peistrup. I'm the lawyer at the consumer products company InStyler.
Great. Chris Rose, where did Chris go? He was here a few moments ago.
Here, Stan. Can you see me?
Oh, there you are. Right. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm a partner at Ariento. We are a MSP as well as professional services in the security and compliance realm, specifically defense contracting.
Yeah. Great. Tim Toohey. Where'd Tim go?
Yes, I'm here, and I'm a lawyer at Greenberg Glasgow. I specialize in privacy and data security matters.
Cool. Well, great. We're grateful to all of you here. George Yusi's not yet on the call. Hopefully he'll be here, with be here shortly. I was thinking about this, because I mean, I've known all of you for years, and as I was putting this together, expert panelists, the jokester in me, if you will, because dare I call you a reasonably expert panel? I leave that as a not so good pun, perhaps. But that said, so just framing reasonableness. What's this subject all about? Why reasonableness? And in some ways, it's because on the legal side, we're seeing it showing up in contracts and laws and places like that. Hence, Bob and Tim and Tom being part of this discussion. Part of it's that there's no 100% security. So somehow reasonableness has got to be, well, just, if you can't be 100%, how good is good enough? We lock our cars, but, we have alarm systems, but, do we have cameras around them to protect them? It's all a relative thing. So how do you begin to navigate this space, if you will? Recognizing, therefore, that reasonableness is something that's relative. It's not going to be the same for everybody. No one size fits all. So what we've done, and this reflects, as I said, this has been a subject that SecureTheVillage has been involved in for quite a long time. That ultimately, we've got a group that meets on a weekly basis, a working group, if you will, that on the subject of reasonableness. First of all, your reasonableness really depends on your risk exposure. And that's the first thing we're going to talk about today. The information you collect, your legal obligations, and your specific business circumstances. Reasonableness also depends on your risk tolerance. Just like there are those who, when they put their money into the markets, are looking for AAA bonds. Risk tolerance is very low, and other people are very, very comfortable in, let's take the over-the-counter market, and we want to play there. Much riskier, but risk tolerance. What can you do and still sleep at night? And then out of that come your own specific security practices. What do you do? And do you do the right ones so that, in fact, you've got this sense that what you're doing is reasonable. It's reasonable for you, not necessarily for someone else. So that's where we're going to head. Want to take the first poll and just get a sense of who's here. So I'm going to launch this. You should see, what industries are you in? I see one in education. Yep. Click all that. Let's see where we're at. And would somebody raise their hand if you can see the poll answers as well as I can? We're up to 57% voted. We got a couple from financial services, one out of education, information security management, IT, MSP, 3, good. Few attorneys, good. Couple of insurance people, some others. That's with 72% of you voting. Okay. All right, let's cut this off. So as I said, it's the biggest are professional services, attorneys, accountants, consultants at 32%. Next 20% are in information security management, good. That's like Chris and me, right? For our IT MSP, good. That's a good to have you here as well.
Dan, is there any way you can show the poll on this?
I'm looking if I can do. Polling, share results. There we go.
There you go.
Yeah.
No problem. Thank you.
So you can see the the numbers of who's here, what. The big line is on the 32% in professional services, consultants, attorneys, accountants, and so on. So that's cool. We'll take more of these as we go. But for now, let's jump into the first panel, which now talks about the information you collect and share and all of that. Tom, you want to lead us off? You do a lot of work in the consumer space, and of course, the first thing we have to be concerned about is personal consumer information. Not the first thing we have to be concerned about. The first thing I put on the list. So why don't you lead us off and unmute yourself?
Well, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me okay, Stan?
Yeah. Oh, now you're fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So as you mentioned, the first thing that one has to do is make some kind of inventory as to the information that your organization has. So you'll need to go through and speak with throughout the organization, because often it's rather surprising what lower level folks, your consumer service representatives may, for example, have access to personal information. So we want to go through and find the kinds of information, and you'll need to really educate the people throughout your organization as well. It's really pretty disconcerting to hear later on, oh, I didn't think you meant this. And so you'll need to reach out and talk to folks throughout the organization in each department, and make sure that you're getting everything that you would consider to be personal information or of some kind.
Yeah, I think that
Our next.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think that's a really valuable piece of insight, how you got to go to all the different groups. Is that, and I'm curious if that's shared by, because I know Tim and Bob, definitely I know you guys as attorneys also play in this space with, the inventory, and Jason as, in insurance as well. You want to pick up the conversation, Jason, on the insurance side? How do you kind of help your people get around the information?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I'll tell you the easiest way to do it. What we do. So we're insurance brokers, we're retail brokers, but we're also risk managers. My background is in technology and a lot of management, professional liability, and risk management. So I wear two hats. So we have a risk assessment, which we'll get into that we go ahead and facilitate. And then as far as how do we get around the personal consumer information, we have a portal that we use for our management system that is secure as best as it can be. And they complete the information accordingly, whether it's for health information or PII, personal identifiable information. So we have them fill it out. A lot of it is also fillable on our website, which is Secure SSL. So they can actually fill it out if it's life insurance, if it's personal homeowners insurance, management liability, or anything from that nature. So we're going to more of a fillable / online secure system where we're able to get the customers or the clients' information. Rather than the old way where they would just fax it or scan it and send it as a PDF, which is not secure.
Right.
That's how we've migrated into that.
Interesting. So as Tom was saying, part of the issue is, are you talking to all the right people there? What you've got is the challenge of it depends very much on how you fill it out. I'm curious. First, maybe Tim, if you want to jump in, when you're advising clients, how do you help make sure the client gets their arms around? I mean, it's the challenge that Tom just raised. I mean, he framed it beautifully, Tom. Yeah.
It's a real challenge these days, because what is personal information is no longer just the limited categories that we had to deal with a few years ago in terms of data breaches, such as names and social security numbers or logins and passwords. We have to deal with privacy laws, including CCPA and GDPR, that consider anything that relates to an identifiable individual as personal information. That is not business information, but it can be anything from sensitive information like sexual preference or race to much more amorphous information that can be put together about geolocation information, biometric information. Now that in coming up with privacy policies and advising on compliance with privacy laws is important, but I think it's also important that that information, whatever it is, be secured. And no matter, as the definition expands, the difficulty of advising people gets harder.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good segue off to you, Chris, because on the one side, you know where all the information is. You may not know what it all is. You know it as file names and bits and bytes, but you also have that security responsibility around it. And again, to part of Tim's point, it's not always, I mean, the definition of what's sensitive is always changing. I mean, you can look at the slide that we have up here, and you can see, even as it starts, like we started with you, Tom, and we'll come back to you with PII, there's a lot of other kind of sensitive information here. What's that world look like? How do you help your clients get their arms around this as looking at it through your lens?
Yeah, I mean, so coming at it from both the technical lens, and I would say as someone who's been.
We're getting some feedback on you.
Oh, are you? Okay.
Yeah.
No, is that better?
Okay. Try it again.
How about now? Is that better?
We'll see. Go ahead.
All right. So so coming at it from the technical lens, as you mentioned, and also the as someone who's been kind of on both sides of the audits when it comes to chasing down information and classifying it, I think what's been said already, but the perspective that we typically bring is first getting a handle on where all this data is through some sort of a data mapping exercise or a scoping exercise to say, okay, number one, as you talked about, what type of information are you collecting and processing? And then the next question is, okay, well, where is it? What systems is it at? Where are these data boundaries? And once we can define the data boundaries of the different types of information, we can then dive in from a technology standpoint or also during audit and certification events and put security controls around it to not allow the information that you don't want to as a company or that the regulators are saying you can't let leave a data boundary unless it's in a specific format encrypted, what maybe.
Yeah. You're still choppy on your so maybe back to you. We'll get that kind of fixed. I want to take it back. I mean, one of the challenges that all this faces, and you look at the information on the left on this screen, just there's personal information, credit card information, obviously information about children has to be treated differently. We'll get into the laws in the next slide. Sometimes it's sensitive customer information. One of the challenges with all of this is just, and again, you addressed it with your first question. Everybody knows a piece of it. How do you take it to that next step? I mean, what does it look like that way? When you go to the next level.
Well, Stan, one of the first questions that you have to do as part of your inventory is to determine the business purpose of each category of information. And that's absolutely critical because a lot of information, it may turn out that there's not a compelling business purpose. And if there is not such a purpose for a category of information, you really should be limiting the extent to which you're warehousing this data in the first place. And you'll find that is going to save a tremendous amount of money kind of going forward, both in terms of data retention, also in terms of litigation exposure and the kinds of information that you might have to produce during litigation. Yeah. So just have, you really don't, if you have no business purpose for a particular kind of data, there's no need to have it in the first place. So data hygiene really plays into this inventory.
Yeah. That's good. Bob, we haven't brought you into the conversation yet. Maybe that's because you're not on video right now. But what do you see as the attorney when you talk to your clients around this whole subject?
Well, I think what I see is that clients are really unaware of the data that they collect. And Barry Weber's on this, and he said the chat asked about unstructured data. You know, it's easy to, in some ways, easy conceptually to talk to various people in an organization about what they're collecting, but there's an awful lot of data that is unaccounted for, and that's a lot of that is unstructured data. So I sort of look at it. First of all, I agree absolutely with Tom. This is the threshold question. Your reasonableness, your information security is going to depend on what you collect. But it's really sort of a who, what, when, where, why, and how process, because you have to know who is collecting the data and who has access to it, who uses it inside and outside your organization. What do you collect? Where is it located? But most importantly, why are you collecting it? And I think that this is something that requires both asking people within an organization and also actually getting into the organization, using some software tools to discover the data, because data is all over the place. And the only way, and you can't really do it just by asking people.
Yeah.
Especially in a larger organization. So as I said, I'm seeing that clients are not necessarily knowledgeable about the data they're collecting. They're certainly not knowledgeable about why they're collecting all of the data, because there's an assumption that data in itself is valuable when data without a reason is actually a liability. So we're looking at clients and trying to get them to be more disciplined, that not only find out where the data is, but to try to be more disciplined about what they're collecting, who has access to it, and then they can effectively start applying some security processes to it.
Yeah, I mean, our experience frankly goes to the whole, it takes a village to secure the village. It takes the entire organization, each looking at their own kind of piece of this security stuff, particularly the unstructured and all the shadow stuff is, for us, we see the most difficult, but it takes the village. It takes everybody looking at that. We're going to take a poll right now, another poll on which of the following kinds of sensitive information you collect or process. So the poll's open. I'll keep it open for a minute, that you can see the countdown timer. And having done the one poll, we should be able to finish this and show it up on the screen right away. Yeah, and even as you're doing that, comment from Barry Weber to everybody, we find that smaller organizations are typically less mature and more likely to have experienced data entropy, tends to dissipate over time that way. I think, Barry, you're absolutely right. If anybody else wants to jump in on that same point while we're taking this poll, feel free, but good observation, Barry. Five more seconds, and then I'm going to stop the poll, and I will display the results. So now
Dan, really quickly, you might want to tell everybody that the poll is available until we do a new poll, the button right next to the chat button on the menu on the bottom.
Oh.
So if you were to minimize it, you're able to see the poll next to the chat and between the participants. So I just want to remind everybody that they can see it intermittently.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thank you. We're still new to Zoom. This is frankly the first time we've done polling in a live event. So Jason, thank you. But you can see here, I mean, 50% in everything except other PII, and not as many of you have concerns about information about children. But personally financial, personal health, credit cards, a lot of that stuff is being collected. I'm going to stop the share results. So what you said then, Jason, if they want to go back and look at it, they can get the poll results themselves.
Yeah, the button disappeared between participants and chat. So I don't know if Devin can put that back up so they can toggle back and forth when they want to.
Hey, George Usage just joined us. Good. Hi, George. So that's kind of okay. So one side of reasonableness, you can't get an answer to that until you've gone and you know what information you're collecting, and the better you understand that, the better you'll be able to map to your own sense of reasonableness, your own reasonableness needs, I guess is the point of that. And then if we go on to the next slide, it also depends on your legal obligations. So there's obviously, I mean, part of why we're all here is there are laws governing all of this. Bob, why don't you kick this one off?
Well, I think that we're getting to the point where virtually every company is subject to some kind of regulatory overview. I mean, when you look at these things, HIPAA is one thing. The CCPA is the California Consumer Privacy Act, soon to be amended a week from yesterday with the CCRA. Every company that has any kind of personal information, and that means every company, is subject to 50 state breach laws, along with the Delaware District of Columbia and so on. So it's not the be all and end all, but the first place that I would consider looking if I were a company is to consider whether you're in the healthcare area, whether you're in a financial services, whether you're a defense contractor, whether you deal with children's information. Those are things which are going to guide you directly into a more distinct set of obligations, a more defined set of obligations. Companies that aren't within those are going to see something that's a little bit more general, the requirements under the CCPA. If you're doing business overseas in Europe or really any other jurisdiction, you have to consider those. So there are legal obligations which are defined by statute and regulation, and there are going to be more and more as we go along. That's for sure. And who knows, we may even one day have federal security and privacy obligations.
Don't hold your breath, right?
No, I'm not holding my breath. I am blue, but I'm not holding my breath.
I hear you. And Tim, on the specific, you have such a strong emphasis on the privacy side, but not an emphasis as much as what I want to say, an expertise, a special expertise on the privacy side here. And of course, GDPR is the first of those. And now California Consumer Privacy Act and all the other ones as well. How are you seeing the reality in the way of what businesses are doing as a result of those kinds of laws?
Well, I mean, GDPR has had a very strange effect, which is that it's become incorporated into many contracts that don't really have very much to do with Europe, but like the idea of there being controllers and processors that have some sort of obligations to one another. And so what I'm seeing is, and that has security implications, particularly because that really requires someone that's considered a processor under European terms, which is anyone that really handles data or stores data, to follow certain security requirements. And though the word reasonable may not be used, the whole sort of approach is that there has to be a kind of chain of command and a contractual obligation.
This and some beans and cabbage in there. And
I don't know where that's coming from.
I don't either.
So I'm seeing that these laws have had some sort of a trickle-down effect, even when they're occurring overseas, and so that the contractual obligations increasingly are incorporating security obligations. So the laws have an effect, and I think we're going to see even more of this, as Bob said, if Prop 24 passes, which it appears to be going to do. So we're going to get more GDPR-like in California, and it will have an effect on legal obligations for companies that were otherwise wouldn't consider themselves particularly highly regulated.
Yeah. Now, Bob, I'm going to go back to you. We go to Tom, because you wrote a blog piece recently on this, that the European courts have held that a basic agreement with the US compliance with GDPR was no longer to be accepted or to be, you know,
Yeah,
what's
there's
that?
been, you're
Why
talking
was
about
that?
Schrems too. And
Yeah.
so the story is that for data transfers from the European Union to any other country, the European Union or just one of the states in the European Union has to determine that that is basically a safe place and that they have adequate protections. And we've gone through, and if the government itself does not impose adequate protections on data, then there are some other ways to do it. One of them is by standard or contractual clauses, but another one has been privacy, have been overall privacy rulings, the privacy framework and things like that. Schrems too. Schrems is a guy who is sort of like our Alistair McTaggart. He's Mr. Privacy there. And he said it's not good enough. Now, the important thing about the decision is that it really relied on the fact that the United States government has very broad investigative rights and the ability to latch onto information. This is sort of a legacy of 9/11 that the government is very powerful, and that's of great concern. Right now, and there's a real question as to whether any personal data can be transferred from Europe to the United States.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be resolved by another set of standard contractual clauses or another privacy shield or one of the other things they've done. It's going to have to be resolved by the way the government does work. Now, there is one thing I would mention, and it goes back to the last slide. One of the things that you can look at in order to comply with the new requirements or the interpretations out of Schrems 2 is whether the data is the kind of data that the government would actually be interested in. So one of the things that you're looking at when you analyze your data is not just generally what data you have, but is that high value data? Is that data that would be of interest to the government? Because if you can make a strong enough argument, there seems to be an opening in the European decision, in the European Union decision, that would allow a standard contractual clauses or something like that to be acceptable. So that is a major issue. It's going to be something that is right now it's sort of taking a back seat because of all the wonderful things that are happening in our lives. But this could entirely cripple transatlantic trade.
Wow.
So, and they're a big trading partner of ours. So,
yeah, absolutely. And I listened to you, and I think of you, Tom, back on the B2C world, if you will, where you're all about consumer information, whether GDPR or some of the other privacy laws. How are you being impacted?
Well, it's certainly something that we're looking at. Certainly, Schrems 2 is something that we're looking at. I don't have any answers at this point in time. We're concerned about it, and we're also concerned about Brexit as well. Brexit is a major deal because of the kinds of contracts that we have with the UK and with Ireland. So it's definitely something that we're looking at. I don't have any pat answers at this point.
Yeah. I listened to, and I've listened to all three of you for a while on this since the Schrems too. And I think, ultimately that's the right answer. This is open stuff, don't really know. Hey, we are going to move on. I'm going to now launch another poll. This one, what are the legal responsibilities, let me launch it, that you and your clients' customers, depending on kind of the nature of your business, are subject to. Let's get a sense of that. So, if you're an end company, put it down for you. But if you're like an attorney, what kinds of situations do your clients have? Or if you're a security manager, George or Chris, what about your clients and so on? And in terms of the chat box, we've been talking about, what are the things that, let's see, who was it? There was something in here. Well, I guess one point in if you followed the conversation between Barry and Weber and Bob Braun on the subject of what Bob wrote about company being data aware from inception, such an important, if you can help a company, if you're with a startup and you can help them get there, I mean, that's fabulous. I'm going to stop polling. It's been a minute. Share the results. Certainly the plurality is California and other state breach disclosure laws. I'm surprised that's not 100%.
Yeah, that does make sense.
But then few Grand Lease Bliley, few COPA, few in DOD, New York Shield Act, but more GDPR, Consumer California CCPA. We're certainly big on that piece. Okay, so let's stop sharing the results and move on now to the next piece of this section, which is what's reasonable depends in part on the nature of your business, both the type of organization you are, and then some of the technology specifics around your business. And since we haven't heard from the security folks for a bit, why don't we start with you, Chris? Let's see if your mic is working better this time. Hopefully it is. Talk some about what you see here about what's reasonable when you're looking at clients, when you think of CMMC perhaps, although that's very specific, but as you're looking at things, how does your sense of helping your clients meet a reasonableness threshold kind of play in this space?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing that we try and do is that better with my mic, by the way?
Yes. Yeah, much better. Whoa.
So the first thing that we do when we bring on a new client is a discovery phase where we try and understand their requirements. A big portion of which is around data, what types of data they have. The other reason that folks come to us is for a lot of times compliance reasons. Specifically, you mentioned CMMC. That is very specific to the DoD space, but it is something that somebody mentioned before, contractual obligations and the trickle-down effect, and that's what we're starting to see from the federal government, at least the Department of Defense. And if you believe the rhetoric, that will spread beyond the federal government, or at least beyond the DoD, and you'll start to see these contractual obligations between the trickle down the supply chain ultimately. And so, from our standpoint, we care about, okay, what compliance industries are you in? What type of data are you collecting, even if it's just intellectual property type data that you want to get out. And then in our discovery, we work to define the boundaries of those data that they want. And as we've said already, it ultimately becomes a risk conversation, and different companies have different risk appetites, and we can recommend, hey, this will make you non-compliant, or from a security perspective, we really don't recommend you allowing that to be part of your data boundary. For example, when I say data boundary, a personal computer. If you are a gardening service that everybody brings their own personal computer, and all you really use is QuickBooks Online and let's say ADP and G Suite, maybe based on the type of information you collect, the contractual obligations and the trickle down effect of your partners, no partners requiring you to be more secure. Your data boundary might include personal devices, which are really hard to secure. Yeah. But if you're coming to us and you're that DoD contractor, well, that's not going to fly, and that can't be part of your data boundary. And so we try and define those data boundaries, and then once that discovery is done, we can start to focus on actually securing the boundaries that we've defined.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Jason, you look at this very complimentary from the way what Chris does. You're the insurance broker, not the security MSSP in this. How do you take a handle on this with your clients?
Just have the discussion. A lot of your previous slide talked about the different regulatory laws. CCPA has changed the underwriting, especially on the data and privacy security liability policies, and having a discussion of what, what they're using for credit cards, what their exposure is, what they're actually, doing on a day-to-day basis, what keeps them up at night, and then figure out and get other resources involved to go ahead and make sure that the exposures are tightening up to put the insurance on the back end.
Mhm.
And that's,
Yeah.
I've always had my toolbox of partner relationships with everyone, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's IT, whether it's a breach coach / attorney, cybersecurity companies, to go ahead and see what the client needs or the prospect, and then basically use resources accordingly, and then fill in the gaps with the insurance.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
And
Well, well said.
that's been my, and
Yeah.
it's worked.
Mhm,
And it's
mhm.
worked.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and what's interesting is I listened to like what you and Chris just said. Once again, the metaphor of the blind man and the elephant, and that's part of the whole concept of why it takes a village to secure the village, because we all see these in different ways, and it's not right, wrong, it's right, right. And so we got to integrate all the pieces together, which brings me to you, George. We've not yet heard from you. And you're a lot about compliance to begin with, but you've also got a very, very deep technology capability, and so what's this elephant look like from your perspective?
It's perhaps I'm too much of a simpleton, but yeah, it's about declaration, right? So what are you declaring as a business? Especially the very small businesses. I think there was somebody that commented, SMBs don't have the resources. And, as long as you're declaring what your position is by, having the bare essentials or minimum functions that's showing that you're proactively addressing something, then you're in a much better position if you do nothing. So even if you don't have all of the technology tools, the technology specifics, or depending upon what your ecosystem and your industry might look like. But ultimately declare, right? This is my position. This is what I'm doing. And then make sure that you're consulting with a privacy / breach attorney, primarily a privacy attorney. So you have that attorney-client privilege in those scenarios where you have a lot of sensitive data. But ultimately, I have always seen this issue of what's reasonable as making sure that you're addressing both the ground war, which are the technologies and the controls, and the air war, which is the business information security role, or the BISO position that's floating around these days. So what does the business information security look like? Is there visibility at the board level? If a board exists, is the owner involved in setting that and declaring what your position is? And I think there's no question that a lot of folks are following what essentially are certain either frameworks or being asked to address through supply chain or industry a specific set of certifications like a CMMC if you're doing business with DoD. So those things will guide you. I think generally for the small business though, your duty of care that you're paying attention to this problem will be critical, even if you're a little tiny business and you can't afford more, a ton. Make sure that you have that, what essentially is the air war address, that you have the cybersecurity policy in place, that you do your best to address the minimum reasonable security needs. And of course, some degree of crisis insurance or like an airbag that deploys if you have a cyber crash.
Yeah.
So because you can only do so much if your resources are limited, a lot of the smaller businesses will lean on their MSPs. So make sure that MSP's shop is in order as well. So as you get into the larger organizations, especially those that are B2C, then you have a whole set of other problems depending upon how you're handling, storing, or stewarding the data. And I've always looked at things from the perspective of, are you proximal, right? And what controls you proximal to the data, meaning you might have access to a room with data in it if you're physically on site as part of your business model, because those companies are impacted as well. Versus are you handling the data versus are you the full steward? Like it's in your systems, you're hosting it, think salesforce.com. You know, they may not be the ones handling the data, but it's in their house, right? And so we've seen some issues there with business specific issues around privacy violations, or CCPA in California specifically. But ultimately, the biggest challenge always is the low hanging fruit. And so even with the smaller businesses, reasonable means make sure that you're aware of what your technology service provider is doing, and make sure that you have at least declared that you're on top of this issue and working with that technology service provider, and that they have a safe house as well.
Sure. Well said. That whole way to bring it down the supply chain that way. We're going to take another couple of polls right now. One more poll, 2 questions. This is about the business specifics in your organization. So again, let's plan a minute. If you've been following the chat log, we got a real interesting discussion going on around reasonableness, the FTC, OCR, Office of Currency, right? OCR, I think. With Barry.
It's the Office of Civil Rights, which is within the Department of Health and Human Services.
Okay. So that's part of the HIPAA.
Yeah, exactly. They're the enforcement branch of the DHS.
Okay.
Of HHS.
Yeah. I found it interesting what you were saying, George, about the air war as well. It's now the blind men and the elephant, but we've now left the plane of the earth, and we're up in the helicopter looking down on this elephant.
Well, what's interesting is most executives are great at the air war, but don't get involved in the ground war and standard topics like marketing and operations, right? Yeah. They can step in and be involved. The minute that it's technology and security related, there are a lot of leaders out there that go, oh, wait, CIO, and they may not be as involved. Now that's for most of the medium and small sized businesses that are out there, because maybe they're afraid of it.
Sure.
But ultimately the outside help, or the helpers that you work with, become critical to that air war that you're fighting. And you don't just want to toss it over the fence and ignore it if you're the CEO, or even if you're the board. You want to make sure that you're always looking at these issues in cybersecurity, because that air war is your job to make sure that you're cascading down the right mindset in how you're handling cybersecurity throughout your company.
Yeah. I'm sharing the poll results now as you were finishing up there, George. On the type of organizational environment, we're seeing a lot of cloud, Office 365, email, those kinds of things. Remote work on organization-owned equipment, but half of you have worked remotely on personal equipment, which raises your risk. And I'll leave it to the attorneys and all to argue in a COVID environment, is that reasonable or not? I think it's situational, but there's that side. Again, on the down below, some of your business specifics, half of you are B2B, 36% B2C, and then one of you, nonprofit, highly regulated, a bunch of you, let's see, in terms of size, there's a mixture. 27% are less than 10 million, but 9% are more than 100, which would put the other 64% in between 10 and 100 million that way. Very few of you have your own clients and customers assessing your security at the current time. We find more and more of our clients are having that done on their part. But good, this is good. Good results, good information. We're going to move on to now another section. Part of the whole subject of reasonableness comes to the things we've just been talking about. The other depends on your risk exposure, your risk tolerance. How serious is a loss of a certain amount of money? How serious is the loss of your environment for a period of time? So let's go through some risk tolerance questions. So here's a question on, and we're not going to take a minute on each of these. We'll take just, like 30 seconds. How serious would a $50,000 financial fraud loss be? There we go. Okay. Let's give it a couple more seconds. We'll give it out to 25 seconds and then we'll stop. Stop. Okay. So what we got, share the results. For most of you, I'm not going to suggest not serious, but not so bad. You've got insurance. That's 39% of you. It's fatal for one of you and extremely serious for another two, 17%. I mean, that's, if you don't have insurance, that's certainly something to think about. Let's see, no, stop sharing this result, go to poll 6. Let's look at it from the other side. At what point does a business email compromise loss become very serious for your business? And again, let's give this 20 seconds. Five, 4, 3, we're counting down. Seeing numbers coding, stop. 2 of you could survive, could go past 200,000, it would become very serious. But another 19% of you, even a small loss, sorry, let me share the results. Yeah, so 2 of you, 19 and 13, 32% could lose some really substantive amounts of money. But others of you real early on, it's, again, it's going to depend on the size of your firm.
Stan, I'm going to jump in and say that I think that there's another question here.
Okay.
Because the question isn't just the dollar amount. The question is, what is that saying about your business and your security practices that you're susceptible to a email compromise? Because it means that so I'd say that even a small loss is something that has to be taken very seriously. It's not necessarily threatening to the business and the dollar amount, but it's threatening to the business in terms of whether the enterprise is properly prepared to handle the threats that are out there.
Good point. Very good point.
Thank
you. Yeah. See if that tracks with the following poll. Let's go on to ransomware. Spend another 20 seconds on this one. What would be the consequences if your IT systems were unavailable for 3 days? This is a ransomware question.
You're assuming no backups, Stan.
Well, even if you have backups, if it takes 3 days till you get them back up.
Okay.
It's entirely possible.
Yeah.
Yes, entirely.
That's right. So, I mean, we're looking at, again, serious, and it goes to the question, again, if you've been following the chat box on this whole question around, and again, it comes from Barry. Thank you for kind of moving this whole chat box thing along. Wow. Do you believe that risk management has a role in defining reasonable security? And Bob came back, I think they're really the same thing, so how one manages this risk goes to the question of how reasonable your security practices are. If something that's extremely serious, that's very or extremely serious, that's 82% of you. It's 100% that it's at least serious. If you could correct that, mitigate that risk for $3,000 or $5,000 or $10,000 or whatever, at what point does it become, again, I'm not sharing the results, my bad, here they are. If you're, at what point do you take action to lower the risk of this kind of thing happening? And as one of the other attendees, Kim Pease, who my business partner And as we all know, most businesses are not prepared for business email compromise or ransomware or so on.
And could you define what you mean by prepared? Because there's a lot of unprecedented ransomware attacks that are occurring these days, and there are, you know, without getting into the technicalities, I know of an entity that suffered one that has had very sophisticated systems and backups, and yet their preparation was that they had an excellent cybersecurity policy that include specific ransomware coverage. So are you including insurance in that, or technical security preparation?
When I talk about preparation, it goes to the nature of the work that I do. I'm looking at it from how well protected are you from it happening, and if it happens, how resilient are you? I think through the NIST cybersecurity framework, identify, detect, protect, respond, recover. And so to me, preparation means having that. I'm going to ask Chris again, because you live in the cyber, so much in the more formal world, how what I just said tracks to you when you talk about preparedness. And then we got to move on into the break.
Yeah, I mean, I think from what we see and just what's being pushed from the government at large is it's cheaper to do it on the front end. I mean, I know that's cliche. I think if you're asking me for the perspective of NIST and the government, I mean, look at the recent history. They required all government contractors to certify to NIST 800-171 to self-attest. They went and did an inspector general report on it, and it was awful. And they said basically everybody's saying that they're NIST 800-171 compliant, and they're not. So they said, okay, we think it's worth the money for us to take on the cost. We know it's going to be higher in our government contracts to stand up an entire auditing body to come, independent third parties to come inspect you on NIST. Than it is for all of the information that's getting stolen by our adversaries. And that was approved by, OMB and Congress and everything. So from a financial standpoint, I think the message, at least from high up in the government regulation, is clear. It's cheaper to do it right on the front end than to pay for it on the back end.
Yeah, and that's true of every quality initiative. I did quality work in late 80s and through the 1990s, and just in the area of software development, you've got opportunity to save 60, 70, 80% of total lifecycle costs in a piece of software by developing it with good quality. And it's the same in any kind of quality management program that I've seen.
The concept of technical debt, Stan, I mean, it just keeps growing. Seems like it's more and more popular.
Right. Hey, we have reached 3:30. We're kind of on our way through, and we're scheduled now to take a break and go into, let me stop sharing these results, and go into a case study. We're going to go into breakout rooms. Every room, people will be able to talk amongst themselves. There's 7 or 8 people, right, Devin, in every room, and there's 8 breakout rooms.
We have 7 rooms with 5 people in them.
Okay, cool. So we're going to put you into breakout rooms. If you want to get up and stretch your legs or something, go ahead and do that, but plan to surface back. It's 3:30 now. Be in your break room by 3:35. And that way, start. The idea is, it's the slide up here. You're the CEO of a company. Your CFO tells you that Mary's computer has a ransomware message on it. The CFO called the vendor. The vendor disconnected Mary's computer from the network. No one else's computer appears to have a problem. So that's the scenario. That's the setup for you in the room. What do you do? So the case study is, as Devin just said, everybody's been broken up into these rooms. Spend about a half hour talking about it amongst yourself. What's the situation? What do you do? What's the order in which you do things? And critically, in a situation like this, what information don't you have that if you had, you could make better decisions? We'll get back together in about a half hour 4 o'clock, and we'll have a general discussion for 20, 25 minutes. Open up to everybody before we go into the final panel of the day. So that's the assignment. I'll leave this on screen. Be back, be in your breakout room, as I said, at 3:35, and to be continued.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and if you that's the question. Framing that question, let me move on to that. And Devin, if you want to start the recording again, good, we're doing that. So if we go on to that question, and we got one slide to talk about, we're going to bring back the panel to do that. But it seems to me, based on, and I'm Michael, I'm using your language and some of the discussion that we had when Barry Weber was here in particular. So in deciding what to do, do we rebuild every computer? Do we reformat every computer all the way down to the base and reinstall the operating system or something? Do we
You might have to, right?
Do we scan it? Do we just put it back and hope everything's okay? All of that has cost consequences, what we're going to do. We've got what's the risk if we do it? If we spend that money, how does that impact our risk? If we don't spend that money, how does that impact our risk? And it would seem to me, there's the hypothesis, so that I'm going to throw it out to somebody on the panel to get started. It seems to me that in looking at what we got to do and the elements of what we got to do are on this slide in some deep ways, it comes to, okay, what's the risk if we do it? What's the risk if we don't? What's our obligation to do it? What's our obligation, et cetera? And again, I think when you're talking about reasonable, the natural place to start is with the attorneys. So again, Bob, let me just throw it to you to just get this piece of the discussion started.
Well, I think we have to go back to our first premise, which is we have to understand what the company does and truly understand what its risks are. And at that point, the company, and this came up in your polling and things like that, the company has to decide what are the risks that it cannot take? What are the risks that are so essential to its business that it is willing to take those? And what are the risks that they can clearly push off on other people or other forms, which can be insurance or it can be vendors and things like that. Once you get down to the point where you realize that there are what risks you're willing to take, then you can look at ways in order to mitigate that risk. And there will be questions about cost, but so much depends on what is there. When I look at all these issues, all of them are things we have to consider. But the exact level of what a company does, the crazy thing about here, one of the things you talked about here are the frameworks, that the formal framework-based policies and standards. Every one of those frameworks depends on individualizing the company's situation. So in order to come up with that reasonable standard, the company has to understand itself. And one thing that I think people don't do enough of, and we've talked a lot about understanding the information and understanding the information that's collected and work on data minimization, which is going to be an issue in California when the when the CPRA is passed and things like that, is very few people have a hold on what their network architecture is and understanding how their network is designed and whether their network is designed in such a way and implemented in such a way that it's not a gaping hole, which I think we see a lot of. So, yeah. So that's how I would jump out. That's what I would start with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, Chris, when you look at like CMMC, it's coming down the pike, required of defense contractors, may have enough momentum to go out beyond the defense contractors because of the need to make sure that your contractors are compliant as well, which could take you out of the direct aerospace supply chain, but more peripheral to it, like your attorneys and so on. What are you seeing in this, in terms of just I mean, you got a formal set of expectations, but how's that playing out in, if you will, in reality for you across the elements on this slide?
So I think that the defense is a unique area. I mean, if you want to extrapolate it, make your own opinion, but I think although I guess we're seeing this in the commercial world too, in terms of bigger partners and their requirements of their supply chain and smaller vendors or service providers or B2B. So in the defense community, you contractually, the government, we have to report the incident to the Defense Industrial Base Network, DIBNet. The Department of Defense has the ability to come in and actually investigate it themselves and touch your systems, right? And the parallel in the commercial world would be you get caught up in a bigger ransomware or phishing scheme and you're a small business and the FBI offers to at least provide some resources, whereas the Department of Defense here says, no, we're coming in. And I think, to Bob's point of knowing your network and your footprint and that network extends to SaaS providers and other vendors, I think, they're even pushing contractual requirements if you want to do business with the government to be able to monitor, or at least when something happens, come in and investigate. And that is extending to the Microsofts of the world and the different bigger vendors. And so they're having to build new, Microsoft government cloud version, and Microsoft is having to contractually guarantee and meet stipulations to say, yes, we're willing to let the Department of Defense or the government or even just our client come in and look at certain things if an event happens in this environment, obviously not in the commercial world. So I think taking it back to this, what Bob said, it does have to do all with risk and exposure. And I think the one thing that we didn't talk about in the case study is, was this just standard ransomware, or was it one of the variants that actually has a data exfiltrating component to it? Because that obviously changes significantly the reporting obligations, the potential exposure and extent of the breach. And I think what we see sometimes with the small businesses, especially on the commercial side, is they don't necessarily really want to know. So if that's the case, okay, well, what's the best that you can do in terms of remediating it and making sure it's gone and not going to happen again? You mentioned, do you re-image the computer? I think in today's world, modern operating systems, it's pretty easy to do that, and that would be the minimum thing that I think a reasonable company of any level is doing is re-imaging at least the computers that they think were affected.
Yeah. So George, if a company comes to you, let me ask this instead of you, George, of you, Tim. Company comes, because you're the attorney here. We'll get back to you and George in another one. Company comes to you, Tim, and says to you, we want you to tell us whether or not we're being reasonable. And you say to them, do you have documented policies and standards? And they say, nope, don't have those. Is that enough for you to say, well, then you're not now reasonable?
I would hate to make a categorical statement like that, but it certainly would be pointing that way. I mean, the problem with the concept of reasonableness, this is a concept that's used by lawyers a lot, and it has a meaning under the law that takes into account the facts and circumstances of individual cases. Was a certain person behaving reasonably under the circumstances, and had they considered what they should be considering? And that can change. I mean, when I think about this incident, what might have been reasonable before the incident that we discussed may not be reasonable after the incident, because at that point in time, let's say this is a zero-day exploit. It's a type of malware that has not been seen in before, But certainly when you go about rebuilding and retraining and regrouping, you learn from your experience. And I think the concept of reasonableness is supposed to take into account learning from the experiences that you go through. So, I mean, I would sit down with a client and say, what kind of data do you have? I mean, there are some small clients that may not be the end all and the be all to have a written response policy. But I mean, I would say if they don't have an analysis of what they've had and they don't know what they have, they don't know where it's located, they have no way of getting their hands around that data inventory, that is per se unreasonable, because ignorance under those circumstances cannot be reasonable in the environment that we live in. Just as the company that was breached with the ransomware is now, the standard has moved because they have more knowledge and they have more knowledge of vulnerabilities, and you don't go back and build something in a faulty manner that was vulnerable the first time around. So they're, you know,
Yeah. That's good, George. We'll go from that over to you then, George. When you're looking at a client and you're looking at them from a compliance perspective, let's say. So let's say they're payment card industry, DSS. They process 6 million credit cards a year or something like that. Now, reasonableness for you, you're not looking at it like an attorney. You're looking at it like a technology operations person. What do you look to, make sure your clients have in place? I mentioned policies to Tim. What about having a CISO or having third-party supply chain management in place, or having an incident response plan? I mean, if they come to you and want to be reasonable and they don't have those things, I would think those are things you would want to make sure they would get.
Yeah, I think the first thing would be to identify what they're doing in terms of risk management. So an organization that's handling that many transactions generally, if you're, let's say their highest level PCI, they're doing billions a year in transactions, let's say retail or something of that nature. Risk management at the CEO level down, like what is that involvement? I would start there, right? So what are you doing to address risk management overall? Because it doesn't necessarily mean that they're in a position where if they don't have a good risk management strategy, that they are not covering all the bases in terms of PCI, because clearly they're being audited every year, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they've got the whole picture. And then what we would generally do is recommend that they're looking at what other frameworks are you considering, and kind of depending upon the business and whether they're international or not. But, we would direct a US retailer to make sure they're looking at NIST as well and not standing alone with just PCI, because they may be missing things, and many of them are doing marketing and have privacy issues. So I would start with that. I would start with that air war, and then I got into the ground war in terms of controls. Understanding maturity, right? So how mature are they in whatever controls that they have in place, and how are they metricing that? How are they measuring that? Because generally speaking, you could call yourself, mature if you are, if the organization has an understanding of what that means. And most IT folks and even cybersecurity operators will, grapple with that issue of what does fully mature mean? What is it that we're doing? In not just our controls, but lessons learned, and as well as how are we visiting the compliance angle as well, and involving other parts of the business. So
but let me segue from that to you, Tom, because I think what you're saying is you work with a client, in your case, George, to help them implement all of this, and of course nothing's ever linear in this world. You do what you can, as much as you can, as fast as you can, and hope that the train doesn't hit you while you're building it up. You got to work in real time. And of course, you're in that space. Where'd you go, Tom?
Right.
Your window. There you are. I'm looking around the
Correct.
all the
Building,
pictures.
building an airplane in flight.
You know, you're out there again in a consumer products company, so you don't have the luxury of being able to quote give advice and hope they take it. You're in the trenches trying to build this as people are moving, as management's moving, and of course, you know, you're always looking at security in the rearview mirror because it's expensive. How do you navigate this space?
Well, we're always looking at expense. I'm always looking at expense and budgeting. So things like our insurance carrier, we want, training will be supplied by, that's one way to cut expense on training is to do it through our insurance carrier. Our insurance carrier is really helpful in giving us a checklist when we apply for insurance or apply to renew every year, a checklist of what they expect us to have in order to be acting at a reasonable level. Our agreement, our contracts, we need to be thinking about contracts that are outgoing contracts, the contracts that we draft and others need to sign, and the vendor contracts that come into us. We need to be looking at what kind of warranties and indemnifications are included within those contracts. We don't always have enough power in the contracting scenario to have the warranties and indemnities that we would like to have. And that's a risk determination that we need to make on a case-by-case basis. So it's really a matter of everyone in the organization being familiar with the issues of data security and just trying to address it on a day-to-day basis on the most cost-effective way we can.
Yeah. Cost effectiveness has shown up and down today. The risk management, cost effectiveness. There's a set of themes that we've been talking about, if you will. I want to go to you, Bob, on that subject and looking at contracts from both directions, from both clouds now. But I want to preface it with this whole discussion. What Tom was saying, and I was thinking of asking you next. For those who don't know it, Bob and I wrote what may have been the very first joint paper ever done between a security operations guy, me, and an attorney in cyber, Robert, Bob. And that was 15 years ago on emerging standard of care. And I think if you look back at that paper, in some ways, Bob, we nailed it. It's certainly evolved since then, quite a bit. But in terms of what you needed to look at, that hasn't changed so much over the years. And now with that as prelude to kind of how do you talk to your clients about, okay, this costs money, this is risk, this, okay, we could legally defend you if you don't want to do this, but we'd really rather if you did. But no, if you're not going to do this, we don't have a chance of defending you. What's that conversation look like?
Well, unpleasant, gruesome, but
I should have known you would say that. Yeah.
Yeah, but this was in the chat room, and someone had pointed out rightfully that the discussion has to be of what does it cost if you do comply? What does it cost if you don't? And the problem is that the cost of non-compliance is actually so high as to potentially be meaningless. So for example, if there is a breach and you don't show reasonable security under the CCPA, you could be subject to $750 per incident. And so if you are a relatively modest company and you have 10,000 individuals, 10,000 information on 10,000 individuals, and it falls within the breach issues, you can be talking about what, $7.5 million right then and there. If you're and considering that I have over 3,000 names in my database, it's not hard to figure out that a company may have, that a $25 million company or is going to have a lot more than that. So, so what that leads to me is that it gets back to the issue of that you start counting where what is going to provide the greatest possible results, what's going to do the best. It's in some ways it's a question. It's one of those comments that that perfect is the enemy of good. There are an unlimited number of things you can do. When our managing partner, when we first started company, as a law firm, we first started automating, his statement was he gave our IT department an unlimited budget and they exceeded it. And that's really what you can get to in IT. I don't think that you can, I think that there are some things you have to do. You can't have you cannot expect it to have any kind of grasp of reasonable security unless you do things like you have it, like you've done a data map, like that you've thought about data minimization, which actually is going to cut your costs in the end. That you have a breach response plan, that you have done training, but there's a point at which you'll say, look, we have things we have to do, and we can't have a perfectly secure system because it doesn't exist and we can't afford it. One thing I will say is that one thing we're often faced with is a conundrum of how do you deal with the business model? Because very often the insecurity is built into the business model itself. We don't like to tell people to change their business model. It's a fool's errand anyway. But we don't like to tell people they shouldn't be doing business the way they are. But very often the real question isn't, well, what kind of procedures do I have to put into place? What are the technical things I need to do? How do I spend all this money? How do I buy more? How many routers do I need? How many sandboxes do I need? And the real question is, are you conducting business in a way that tends to minimize your risk profile? And if you can do that, to me, that's when you start getting real efficiencies into the system.
Yeah. Well said. That's the final word on this piece. I want to go to kind of a path to reasonableness. And again, I'm purposely playful. I find the word reasonable such a reasonable word to use, at least in a reasonable context. So here's a reasonable path. What we didn't talk about on this last slide is the use of expert support, ranging from information security operations like George and Chris and I do and others, the information security privacy attorney, cyber risk insurance broker, certainly, and then even on to bankers, your banker. And if you get relationships with law enforcement, that's really good, particularly in industries like financial services, to have those built up. But what we wanted to put together, when I say we the board and the panelists here, kind of, okay, so how do you think through in a reasonable way your own security? And it seems to really start with forming your leadership team. Who are the people that you're going to look to, both inside your company and outside your company, for helping you figure out what's reasonable for you? And that's what you just said, Bob, an executive, a manager, leader in charge. Your IT vendor has got to be a piece of that, because again, I'm looking at you, Bob, but you talked about architecture and Chris and George and Ara. I mean, those people need to be at the table. You need cybersecurity expertise as well. And that's operations people like George and Chris, attorneys, Tom and Bob and Tim, and your cyber risk broker. I mean, Jason had to leave early, so he's not here now. But really get those people and put them together and use them. These aren't full-time jobs for anybody in a small company, but it's the knowledge and expertise and wisdom of these people coming together to create value, ultimately, to create the solution. What everybody said, document your risk exposure. What information do you collect? Where is it stored? How is it stored, et cetera? That's your specific business circumstances. And the other circumstances around that we talked about, you can go back and watch that part of the presentation again. And all of that in the context of, GDPR, CCPA, breach disclosures, HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, COPPA, et cetera, the FTC safeguard rules. Out of that, we didn't spend much time talking about specific frameworks, but you need a framework. in which to look at cybersecurity. And there's three standards out there. I mean, one's the most technical is the Center for Internet Security. The most management is ISO 27001, and you've got the NIST Cyber Privacy Cybersecurity Framework in between. But pick a framework when you do this. And pick any of them. We tend to use NIST and the Center for Internet Security for most of our work. Assess your practices against the framework. Identify your gaps. If you don't know where you are, as the proverb goes, a map's not going to help you. So you got to know where you are. Okay, here's all the stuff that we all agree, the team, the experts, the attorney, et cetera, that we got to do. What are the gaps? Now that you know your gaps, you can identify what's reasonable there. Okay, here's something that we ought to do it, but you know, it's, yeah, okay, that's reasonable. We'll do it, but we can't do it this quarter. We'll do it next quarter. So it goes on the roadmap. Or maybe you do it right away, or maybe you put it off to next year when you got more budget or whatever. But you plan it in if it's something you and your people all deem as reasonable. And if you don't think it's reasonable for you, at least document it so that, again, if push comes to shove and you got to explain, well, why didn't you do that? You've got a capability to here, look at this. Here's what we did, and here's why we did it that way. And then from then on, it's ongoing. It's forever rinse and repeat, as we say. So that's kind of a overall flow chart, if you will. And thanks, Steve Krantz, who you see there, for the strong suggestion that we include this. So I want to thank you for that. Also, I want to move on just in the interest of time. We said we'd finish by 5. So I'd like to do that. Also, in part to Steve Krantz, who said you're never going to finish by 5. And I said, watch me. And hi, Steve, we're going to finish by 5. Thank you. But the next slide is where do you get more resources? I said at the beginning, this was going to be, let's look at this kind of as end to end as we could, knowing we can't go deep. So we know we got to go to more resources. We've got on the Secure the Village website a ton of stuff. I'm grateful. A lot of you have been panelists with me on the monthly webinars that we've got. That's what all of this is in the resource kit we've built together over the last 2.5, 3 years since we started that. We have put together, and it's the last bullet on here, minimum reasonable security practices. Okay, is that going to hold up in law? We don't know. But if you're subject to CCPA, we got together in the same kind of spirit of it takes the village to secure the village. We put together a set of practices based on the Center for Internet Security and ISO and the NIST framework that we consider minimum. It goes to the question I asked Tim earlier about, well, if you don't have this, can you say you're reasonable? And good attorney that you are, Tim, you said, well, it depends, because in fact it does. But at a certain level, maybe it no longer depends. I mean, if you're Google or IBM or, a bank, John, if you're, maybe it does, in those cases, the depending goes over. So again, it's not the last word. Today's not the last word, nor are all the things on the resource kit the last word, but they're guides. They're aids in helping us as a community get our arms around how do we do what's right? How do we do what's rational? How do we spend money when we need to? Don't spend it unnecessarily. Those are the kinds of questions we need to be considering here. Wrapping up, Steve, I still got 3.5 minutes. This is our new website. We'll be coming out with this in the next couple of months, certainly by the end of the year. It's going to make it so much easier to find stuff. We'll be importing all the webinars and all for that. So look forward to that happening. We have right now 4 webinars a month on our rotating schedule. We've got also an invitational workshop. If you're in the workforce development area, your company is, let Devin or me know. We want to get you invited here. We're going to form a national working group around workforce. It's such a big need, both for the workforce the need for the workforce, but also the need for people to have good careers, and particularly in minority areas, it's a great thing. We're going to spend a couple of hours on that. So we have those. I mentioned our weekly news of the week. We're now in our 11th year. God, it's hard to imagine that we started this thing 10 years ago, but it comes out every Sunday, and you can sign up for it if you're not already on the Secure the Village website. A lot of stuff we do, including, I'm going to spend some of this last couple of minutes on your book, Steve. So if I go over, I can blame you for it. But Steve's written a book for residents. It's not for businesses. It's not the stuff we've been talking about today, but homeowners, families, they need this stuff every bit as much as businesses do. Different reasons, obviously. Rule 1 for a family, freeze your credit. And Steve's put this book together that goes into a lot of depth on what the individual, what residents can do to secure their stuff. So there is that. I've come out with my first book having nothing to do with cybersecurity, but having to do with what I think is the security of the nation. I started writing essays on what I call it on freedom back in the Thanksgiving of after 9/11. And that led 18 years later to well over 70 essays on this subject that I've compiled and put together in a book. It's available on Amazon. And I'd like to think that what we're doing with Secure the Village is part of a healing of America that has to go on. I mean, we're all here because we care about cybersecurity and the implications of that in our businesses. But as we strengthen each and every business, we're really strengthening the fabric of the economy. And as we work together to do that, we're learning as a people to work together across. I mean, the subject of politics never came up in this meeting, nor should it have. It's irrelevant. So if we can do this here, perhaps we can do this in other places as well. You know, I would kind of like to believe that. Here's some contact information for every, the panelists. I am so grateful to all of you, Bob, Jason, Tom, Chris, Tim, and George, and all the others who are here. I mean, I'm just looking at who's still here as we kind of wind down. You all made this the event that it is, or that it has been. It's going to get on the internet. We'll clean up the video, post it over the next few days. And just to finish up, the future is not a gift, it's an achievement. And that's not just true in the political realm, which was when Bobby Kennedy said it, but for all of us. We lift ourselves up by working together. And that's the premise of Secure the Village, that it takes the village to secure the village. That's what we're about. Thank you all for joining us, panelists. Again, I am so grateful for your wisdom, your time, your energy, and everybody else who joined us, at least for part of this road. Thank you all. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And as soon as I find the right button, I am going to end the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan.
Great job, Stan.
Super.
Thank you. This is wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you, Stan.
Thank you,
well.
Stan,
Stan.
everybody.
Great preparation.
Thanks, all
Very
panelists.
much appreciated.
Very timely.